and Trauma Responsive Communities Act that has bipartisan support. So if you're interested in learning more about that, that will be announced next week, and there'll be opportunities, I'm sure, through some of our agencies and others to get involved in communicating with Congress about why this is so important. Because what you heard again and again today is the resources need to be there, but they also need to be there for sustained periods of time for us to really be able to meet these needs. So those are just a couple of things that you can learn about. I think another thing that we're going to talk about is, as I introduce each of these people, is if they have anything that they've got going on that they want to get more teacher voice with, we're going to make sure that that gets highlighted as well. So I'm going to just pass this along. We're going to let Maurice go first and just have each of them introduce who they are, where they work for, and what is some of the key initiatives that they are working on right now around this issue of trauma, around how do we address equity, and how do we promote justice in our schools and communities.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Good to see you. First, let me personally acknowledge members of the Indigenous community who are in this room, or family members of Indigenous community members. I want to make sure that I am forming allies wherever I go, and to be respectful that the land was not ours first. And so I just want to put that out in the universe for all of us. Second, I am the Chief Equity Officer for Chicago Public Schools, former high school principal, assistant principal, instructional coach, and English teacher. The work of equity is deeply important to me as the former principal of Tilden, where I had a high, like 33% STLS population, 40% diverse learner, and everything else that one might count as a deficit to our school community, but also lifting up that our kids were assets in our building was extremely important to me. Recognizing that our kids were coming to us as beautiful young people who were trying to figure out their lives, and that the institution and the structural racism that was at play causes the trauma that we see. And so when my faculty and staff, when we started to deeply learn that, it started to transform our internal practices. And one of the key parts of my role in Chicago Public Schools is making sure that we are doing this shift from trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, trauma-responsive, but to really get to healing centers. That when kids walk into our spaces, whether they're in schools or community centers or wherever they are, they feel welcomed into those environments. And that we are also supporting the adults who serve young people, because we also know that secondary trauma is a real thing. And so we want to make sure that our teachers are well, and that we are doing the things that cause wellness to be heightened across Chicago Public Schools, and we can come back to that later.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jen Johnson. I was a high school history teacher for 10 years at Lincoln Park High School, and 6 years ago, I came to work here at Chicago Teachers Union. I've worn a lot of hats. Currently, I'm the chief of staff here. And so the best opportunity that we have currently, right, to advocate for more healing-centered schools, I agree, that is the reframe, is through our contract and through bargaining. And so if you're a CTU member, if you're not familiar with our bargaining demands, you can go on the CTU's website, ctulocal1.org, and there's a place on the website called the member portal, which is where we put documents that members can access. And if you haven't read the contract demands, you should read them. They are very much taking on this lens, right, of what our students need, because they are our precious jewels, right? And that's what this is all about. While we also have demands on pay and benefits for our educators, because that is a part of their longevity, right? Their ability to stay in this career. We have demands on increasing the number of counselors in our schools, social workers, psychologists, all types of clinicians and wraparound services. And we are trying to have a dialogue around what does it mean to have police officers in schools. And we know that in some schools, people feel like having SROs it's all they have, and so they want to keep it. And in other schools, we're having a broader dialogue about what safety looks like, right? And whether police officers contribute to a positive school environment at all. And so one of our demands is that we should look at reducing at least the number of police officers in schools in order to help fund additional support staff that do wraparound services and supports. And hopefully we'll be in more dialogue. The one thing I will mention before I pass the mic is we fought very hard in this last contract for an initiative, a joint initiative with CPS called the Sustainable Community Schools Initiative. And this was a vision of our community allies and partners. It was something that local neighborhood-based organizations said, this is the kind of school model that we need to advocate for, a model of shared leadership where administration, educators, community groups, parents, and students come together to make decisions about what students need, and that there's resources behind that. So the 20 schools that are a part of the initiative have a lead community partner, and between the school and the community partner, they are receiving up to $475,000 in order to invest in whatever that school deems necessary around some frameworks that we've provided for them, including restorative justice practices, socio-emotional learning, and parent engagement. So we're really excited to continue to fight for that initiative because we think it's just in its infancy. So we hope that we'll be able to win that in our new contract.
Hi, I'm Hallie Quesada. I'm a teacher and a CPS parent, and I'm up here today because I'm a member of Janice Jackson's Teacher Advisory Council. And originally, I thought I was signing up, as well as the rest of my group members, to work on the social emotional learning. And we realized through our work that we really weren't talking about SEL at all. We were talking about mental health. And so when we're talking about trauma, when we're talking about anxiety and depression, we're talking about mental health. And the top 5 illnesses facing children today are all mental health illnesses, not physical illnesses. So it's really paramount to our work. However, the CPS mental health policy that came out of the Mental Health Act of 2003 hasn't been updated since 2003. And when we talk about things like policy and bargaining and contracts and things that are written on paper telling us what to do, it's really important. At the same time, we've grown so much over the past 15 years without that piece of paper changing. So there's a lot we can do while we wait. We want more money to do more things. We want more top-down support, but we can also start now. And there's a lot of advocating that can come from teachers. And we will be presenting sort of our plan to top district officials, including Janice Jackson, and I think you'll be there on June 10th. And I'll just, one last thing before I pass the mic. You're also welcome to get my name. It's hfquesada@cps.edu, and I'm happy to share the plan that we've put together.
Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Akame Crowder. I'm a senior organizer at Community Organizing and Family Issues, which is COFI. We're a 23-year-old organization that's been working with parents to do leadership development and support them to make changes at their schools and in their communities, and also at the systems level. We are working primarily in really challenged communities, primarily with women of color, although I have here today Dexter Leggins, one of our faithful participants, who will also talk in a minute. But because they are living in the areas where they're living, a lot of the issues that are impacting them are the issues that we've been talking about for this whole day. And so we've been working on the school to prison pipeline since 2004, working to create a climate of restorative justice versus punitive zero tolerance. I don't know how many people were around when that was kind of the key word, but we've been working for 10 years to really combat that. Also really looking at alternative discipline programs, which is where I think a lot of what we're talking about today kind of intersects. And Dexter will talk a little bit about our Peace Center model. Right now, we are working on the consent decree and looking at police in schools and how to get rid of police in schools, but even in the meantime, have an understanding of what some sort of definition of their role can be, so that they are not involved in discipline, but are only intervening when crimes are actually committed. I have 3 really specific asks of you all today. So we do statewide advocacy around these issues through our Elementary Justice Campaign. You may or may not have already heard about the Rethinking Safety Campaign, which has 2 specific legislative initiatives. One is Senate Bill 1941, which is the Safe Schools, Safe and Healthy Schools Act. And what that would do would be to create a grant program that would fund counselors, restorative justice, and other initiatives. Also, House Bill 2084 would be money to look at real analysis of police and schools, what the impact is, so that we can really continue to advocate to address that issue. Also, ISB, so Illinois State Board of Education, they just are wrapping up a listening tour, and what they're doing is they're rethinking the ratio of academic standards versus other things like climate and chronic absenteeism, and they're thinking about how to give more weight to the non-academic factors when evaluating schools. And so those are three opportunities that I think we should all be thinking about and taking advantage of right now. And I just want to hand the mic over to Dexter Leggins.
Good afternoon. Excuse my voice, I'm coming over cold. My name is Dexter Leggins. I'm from the west side of Chicago. None of these STEM, I work with Kofi and an organization called Power Band. I'm also work with parent engagement at my school. I'm the only school in the city of Chicago to have a peace center within the school that's supported by my principal. The peace center. I did not realize how the Peace Center really actually affect kids until a couple of years ago when I started working with the social and emotional part of it. I'm not a case manager, I'm not a social worker, but the trauma that our children go through every day. And because 5 years ago I moved into the community, I see the trauma they go through. I'm in the trauma every day they work through. So with the Peace Center, I have a better feel of what they're going through every day, you understand? And by being a parent of a public school, I have a kid in the school that I'm at. I'm also a foster parent, but I have my son Jalen in the school. He's a diverse learner. He's also came from trauma. So with the Peace Center in the school and the different social emotional part of the Peace Center, we have helped Jalen come from, let me see how can I say it, from a student that's always in trouble to, I just got a call this morning that he went up 21% on his testing. So he's doing very well, and it's all about the Peace Center, my principal, the staff, and the teachers. We all bought into this together. They wasn't for it all in the first. At first, they didn't buy into it, but they did buy into it. Parent engagement is so important into public schools, especially in my area. What else can I say? I mean, it's just, by being a parent, you expect your kids to succeed. And so a lot of parents just send their kids to school and hope the teacher teach them. But the kids got to go to school in order to want to learn. If they're teaching and he's learning, it is better. For Jalen, and I keep saying Jalen because I'm very proud of him, I adopted him, finally Christmas he became out. I adopted him. Jalen's no longer on medication. He's going to school every day. He loves school. But this is one of the things that the Peace Center and parent engagement and being in the community helped Jalen. Jalen, I can't say it enough. When he first got to school, he was on 4 or 5 different medications. He's on none. He's playing football, he's playing basketball. Don't get me wrong, Jalen's still having a little trouble. But other than that, Jalen's doing fine. But it's important that we buy into the Peace Centers, restore justice, and parent engagement. I can't say it enough about the parent engagement piece. And Power Pack is the group that I'm affiliated. I have a code. I really talk more than this, but that's all I have to say about the piece.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachel Wybrow. I'm a program manager at the Office of Social Emotional Learning. And I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about the Healing Trauma Together grant. So the Department of Education awarded a grant to Chicago, St. Louis, and Baltimore through promoting student resilience. And so Chicago was awarded $2.3 million to create 10 trauma-informed high schools, implement effective mental and behavioral health services in those high schools, and then the key is evaluating the effectiveness of those services. So we were able to partner with the American Institute of Research to evaluate the data that we collected. The schools were selected based on the criteria of having a recent shooting in proximity to the school, high rates of civil unrest, high ratios of student counselors, social workers to students, high percentage of student off track, lower attendance, and then also principal commitment. So we selected schools that really had that administrative buy-in, which was really key in implementing this work. And so we use this opportunity to truly use a 3-tiered approach. So as I'm sure you all are familiar with, so we did tier 1 trainings to train staff in ways to recognize symptoms of trauma and also to do basic triage, as well as refer those students appropriately. Our tier 2 intervention was Sparks small group training. So that is usually done with groups of about 8 to 12 students. And then our tier 3 training was individual trauma-focused CBT for identified students. And once students were identified as having experienced trauma, we administered 2 evaluations. So one is the TESE, which is an inventory of how many traumas that the students have experienced. If the students experience more than one, they were then administered the CPSS, which basically measures symptomology of PTSD in the student. And what we found was that over 96% of students had experienced at least one traumatic event. The average was 9. So the average traumatic events that these students had experienced was 9. As far as PTSD went, about 50% of students were found to have clinically significant PTSD. And so they were then referred to either these tier 2 or tier 3 services. Unfortunately, I don't have the final numbers, but the preliminary findings that AIR, who is doing the evaluation, is that the PTSD symptoms have been reduced, and also the number of in-school and out-of-school suspensions was reduced by almost 3,000 days across the 10 schools. So it's a model that we really know works, and we're working towards sustainability. It's very expensive to have a clinician full-time in each of these 10 high schools, but we are applying for grants, as well as helping schools to leverage relationships with community-based organizations that perhaps may be able to bill Medicaid, et cetera, for this very important work that they're doing. And the unexpected finding, well, maybe it's not unexpected, but wasn't something that we were particularly looking for, was a lot of the feedback that we got from staff was that they're experiencing a lot of secondary trauma and a lot of compassion fatigue. So they had gone through these trainings, but then were feeling a little bit unsupported moving forward. So we are now in the 3rd year of the grant, a no-cost extension year, and so we've been able to provide some self-care workshops to address some of the issues that the staff brought forward.
So I'm going to test those of you that were here this morning. How many, does anyone remember what the ACEs statistics were that Audrey said? What percentage of Americans in the original ACE study had an ACE score of, had been exposed to more than 4 things? It was a lot less than 90%, right? So we're talking about 90% of the students in this high schools that they were studying having had the traumatic exposures. They're not counting the exact same things, so just know that ACEs is a set of kinds of experiences, where what they were talking about was traumatic exposures. But when we talk about how do we possibly leverage resources, this is what we're talking about. That we really have high levels of stress in our communities. And so kids are coming to school with really high levels. So I think it's really important many of you may have been in schools that have had various grant initiatives that have come and gone and brought in mental health services or brought in training and then they've left. And so part of what the energy we're looking for at the end of this day is to say, how do we elevate our voices to say, we're done with just a little program that's here and gone. We really need to be thinking about how to do these in sustainable ways. So the model that we have with the HGT, what's really great about that, Healing Trauma Together, is that there's research evidence out there. It's the first time the district has really been able to do universal screening. We've all been kind of wondering what the baseline is for trauma. And so I think it's really important to know that when we went to our most highest impact schools, we found very high rates of exposure to trauma. And so that's why this conversation is so important today, is we need to think about those best practices. So I guess a question that I heard as you were all sort of mumbling and talking and then looking at each other is this question of sort of, I guess, bringing different voices to these conversations. I hear each of you are working on important initiatives, but the question of sort of what are some strategies that you have found effective? Because we can all sit in here and say we need more youth voice. We all saw an amazing example of a very engaged young person this morning. How do we think about, I guess, I'll separate it into two questions. How do we do a better job? What has worked for you in terms of getting youth involved in thinking about these issues of restorative practices, rethinking safety, being able to really think about what their emotional needs are? Does anyone have ideas of things that have worked?
So we have a lot of committees at the CTU, like a lot of committees. If you need more meetings in your life, I got a meeting for you every day of the week. But what is really exciting about this is that educators are engaging in these conversations with parents and students via some of our CTU committees. We've got a special education task force that works regularly with parent advocates, students, right, and other allies. And we've started a practice recently of doing listening events. So we had one on bilingual education. That's actually something that, right, is impacting an increasing number of students in CPS. They're not getting access to bilingual ed, which is very traumatic actually for them to potentially lose their language or have their language and their culture disrespected in school. We're having a listening session next Thursday at this hall for early childhood. And these are open. These are not just for union members. These are spaces where parents, community, and students are welcome to come. And that's helping build some of the relationships across those different constituency groups so that they can take action together, so they can do events together, so they can advocate together. We have a lot of joint committees also where we sit down and meet with the district on a regular basis. And it's something that I'm really excited to think about. How do we involve students in those spaces? So we do have some spaces where there's lots of different people coming together, and we need some more.
If I can piggyback on that, I think, and this goes, we were having this conversation earlier, you don't need to have power to take power. There's enough power for everyone. You're not even taking it away from somebody else. We can all have our little piece of power. And I think our district really is set up in a way that it wants to support building leaders from within. So you can, if you want to take a kid with you, you can support a kid in having this voice. You can also, you don't even have to be on the ILT. You can go to your principal and ask about the ILT agenda. Ask if it is the behavioral health team meeting with the ILT. Because can we pretend that behavior doesn't impact instruction? We can't. And you can be that voice and you can push for that change. You can also lead by example. When we were talking with the talent and development team, if somebody from that team is here, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the usage of EAP, our Employee Assistance Program, the use of the 3 free mental health consultations is 1%. So us as teachers, when we think about our own self-care and reducing stigma and being in a place mentally to be able to support our kids, we need to start leading by using the resources that are already there.
So as a principal, there were multiple things that we tried, and I'll tell you a couple of things that worked well and what to avoid. What worked well for me as a leader is I had to increase my level of vulnerability to allow space for people to say when they were okay and when they weren't okay, so that we could unearth like what are the needs of the adults who serve our young people first, Instead of saying you're not doing well because of, it's like, hey, what's happening and how do we support you in your own adult experiences? So one of the things that we did at Tilden, and I'll go back to your principals and say, I told you to go back with this one, but we had a phrase that said, I need to go to the STO, S-T-O, and that would mean staff timeout. And if anyone on our campus said to another adult, I need to go to the STO, that means somebody needs to step in immediately and give that person room to just take a breath, go get some coffee, whatever that person needed, because we had, as we were studying and building our own knowledge and skill set around trauma and trauma-informed care, there has to be this space for us to figure it out, and we wanted to just have that space for adults. Another thing that worked is even I, as an administrator, had to go to the peace room with young people. And because I knew when Maurice was like getting this heightened sense of experience, and I knew that I could use my position of authority to alleviate the problem, but that removes the child from school, which impacts learning, and it has this kind of residual effect on what the outcomes are. And I also had to do a better job with understanding students' experiences of school and in school. So how I thought we were doing school was not always how kids received school from us, and we had to figure that out. The third thing that I would say is to avoid, we at times, like every year, we would assign a student to an adult in a building. That every student had some sort of relationship or connection with the adult. If I could do it all over again, I would allow kids to choose. Who is the one person in this building that you feel very safe and have a trusting relationship with? And that would also tell us, you know, how do we need to elevate the practices of our staff who are doing exceptionally well in this trauma-informed care or SEL work. But the more we listen to student voice in those very small ways, yielded the greatest dividends. And so that's the one thing. Every kid, we have to have it at least documented somewhere where every kid says, you know what, when I'm feeling this way, I can go to this person. And if that person is not available, I can go to that person.
So I want to talk a little bit about parent engagement in this conversation. And one thing that, I'm hearing that there's a lot of spaces where there's, a number of people, this sort of cross-sector collaboration. But I do think it is important that, people first talk to their peers and together kind of decide what collectively, what do they want to do? What do they want to work on? What's important for them to then bring to the larger tables? I think sometimes the tables can be intimidating, and people often have a hard time finding their voice. And so finding even collective voice, across peers to then inform collaboration is very key. And I also think that, this idea of trust is just a big part of all of this work, right? Having relationships, regardless of whether you're trying to get people to advocate, get people to the table, or just sit down and have a conversation, trust is just key to the whole thing. And so, I think of parents as partners. That's the way that we do our work. And I think dealing with young people, parents, whoever, that's, we have to listen to what they have to say. We have to figure out how to support, the things that they are looking to do. And we have to really build those relationships.
I think that when children have trauma, they need somebody to talk to. As adults, we go to them. Sometimes the child needs to come to us. And with me in the Peace Center at my school, I've developed a trust with most of my students. So when they have a problem, they go to the dean or they go to the principal and they go see Mr. Leggins. We talk about it. Everybody think Peace Center is all about if you're in trouble. It's not always if you're in trouble. We have peace circles, but a lot of times we just have restorative chats. And it's just sometimes the kids just want to get off their chest of what's going on in the school, what's going on at home. And we keep it all confidential. Sometimes, every now and then, there's some things at home that you got to go to the principal Or the counselor said, look, I can't handle this. So it's very important that you be consistent. You listen. You don't tell the whole school what's going on. In fact, you don't even talk about it. You just talk to the student, but more than anything, they need, in my neighborhood, I live in West Garfield Park. It's not a joke, it's real, the drugs, the gangs, it's real. So my kids from preschool to 8th grade have trauma every day just coming to school. You can buy drugs on the way to school. You see people laying out on certain streets coming to school. So trauma is real, so when they have someone to come to, especially a public school that's like the sanctuary in the neighborhood, it used to be the churches, now it's the schools. They need somebody they can trust, and they don't want to hear what you got, they want you to listen, and then say what you got to say.
Just one thing about the trust, especially as a teacher, when we think about trust, I think it has to come with that critical mindset that children are capable problem solvers who want the best for themselves. So like you were saying, your job isn't totally to tell them what to do, but sort of to be their, the guide, the consultant that helps them figure it out on their own. But trust means believing that kids are smart and they want what's right for them.
So lots of themes of trust, of vulnerability, being able to model that it's okay to not be okay, right? And to be able to say, I need help. We see that a lot in schools, that in order for kids to believe that it's okay to bring these things up, it's really important than adults. But we also need the resources to bring them strategies. So part of what I love that you just said, Dexter, was this idea that you are in a space where you're asking a lot of questions, but sometimes the information gets to be too much. And I think it's okay, and kids are really all right if you say, you know, that's a problem that's kind of bigger than something I'm trained to deal with. Can we use our relationship to think of another adult that we can engage who can help both of us, right? So it's not like, oh my gosh, this is too much, I freeze, but it is saying, I'm an adult who cares about you, but I don't have all the answers, and we don't expect you to have all the answers. So I hear a lot of that kind of theme of modeling what it is that we want the kids to do. Given that we're near the end of the day, I think it's important, since we've been listening a lot today, to also invite you to come up if you have any questions. So we do have a microphone here. So if any of you feel like there's a question that you have for the panel, or a comment that you'd like to bring around this question of how we might build more cohesive teams to support kids in schools, I'd love to invite you up here to do that. Otherwise, I'll keep throwing questions at them. But if anyone has a question they want to ask, please come on up and we'll let you ask those questions. Are you coming forward? All right, yay. Can't tell she was just sneaking out the back and now I'm making her give us a question.
So I'm Leah Schreier, I'm a school psychologist at CPS. And I think I agree that it's important that our colleagues and peers, we can get together and advocate for more social emotional services, or thinking of that framework, sorry, I can't think of the right words, and bring it to the table, as someone said, bring it to the big table. But I'm interested to know, it's so important, I think critical, that in school administrators, principals have to really be on board and supportive. So what's the messaging from top down, from the bigger table to the school big table? You know, is that being prioritized in terms of what's looked for in principals and administrative, and part of the expectations of principals to be more flexible, open-minded, to think about things in this different framework?
Talk about that, sort of where your department is impacting the talent department and thinking about leaders within CPS.
I want to reframe the question to make sure that I answer your question. Are you asking me what is like CPS's kind of executive leadership responsibility or role in pushing a certain ideology that we have to have restorative practice of behavioral health in schools? Is that?
Or that it's important that, because I think for any change, it has to be supported from the top down, so I'm imagining that the principals need to know that that's something that's prioritized higher level.
I do think, as a former principal, that I heard that a lot. As a principal, what I was grappling with was the how, like what is the process by which we kind of bring a school community through becoming this healing center. And I think we have to do a better job of going beyond saying the terms restorative practices. And then we have to continue, like we have to say that, but we also have to figure out what are the health, social, emotional needs of our kids, and how do we support schools in collecting that information to be in better service of students. So I do think we have some work to do. I do think we say it and we acknowledge it, but to make the how more accessible is important. And I do think we have to have conversations about like how do we create this sort of pipeline so that our young people who are coming through our schools and our systems want to fulfill these roles later on. Like one of our former graduates graduated from college last school year, and we just happened to be at a graduation out of town, and she was there, and she says, yes, I became a social worker because you all helped me through school. And I thought, that is something we have to focus on to build a pipeline so that we can also stop saying we don't have enough, and we have all of our brilliant young people who can bring these sort of experiences back to us and help to refine our work. But it is something that we say, but I also kind of hear we need to do better, and so we will do better. Yes, I'm sorry.
And for Teacher Advisory Council identified that as an issue too. And when we were looking at the mental health policy and how do you actually translate that so it shows up in schools and classrooms, we had questions for the district. And these questions were all really centrally focused around student mental health, teacher mental health, and we were directed to 7 different offices. And so the first step is just bringing those offices together. And there is work already happening in CPS to start that right now. Bring them together with the central frame of mental health. We also, if you're in Chicago Public Schools, you know that there are these network summits. And we have them for every academic field. Where is the network summits for social emotional learning and mental health, both for teachers and parents? And the courses exist. They're on Learning Hub. So something you can do right now is sign up for those classes. Show the district that this matters to you, especially because there's a group of teacher advocates who are pushing for it.
So I'll just add that the Sustainable Community Schools, 20 schools that are in place are using a 6-pillar model. If you haven't looked it up, you can look up the Center for Popular Democracy and the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools report on community schools. And most community schools around the country provide additional wraparound services, programs after school, right, parent engagement. But what often is missing is the question was really about is about shared leadership. And so the Center for Popular Democracy report has the 6th pillar of community schools as shared leadership. And so we're trying to cultivate not just an expectation, but a desire to open up a leadership table at the school that isn't based solely on who's in the building during the school day. So each of our 20 sustainable community schools should have a leadership team that convenes regularly, that includes parents, that includes students, that includes educators that are in the school building, in making decisions, not just listening to one another, not just hearing each other out, which is vital. You have to do that to create the relationships, but to also determine where do resources go. And students being a part of that is really, really powerful, right? Because they know exactly what their peers are thinking and needing and talking about. We've actually had 3 professional development days for those 20 schools in this hall, and several of the schools brought students with them. They were encouraged to, so we can kind of see which schools are doing a really great job of lifting up these leadership teams and involving parents, because if they brought them to the PD, they're doing the work. And then we could see what schools need more assistance with parent and student involvement and engagement in making decisions, right? And do we need an after-school counseling program, or do we need a full-time counselor during the day, right? And the only other thing I'll say is I think student-based budgeting has been a really hard thing that has limited choices. It's put principals in the position of making the wrong choices because they don't have the right choices at their feet, because they don't have the funds. And so, you know, we need to invest, and we need to make principals actually be able to choose from several wonderful choices, and not, do I have an art teacher or do I have a librarian, right? Do I have a full-time counselor, or a half-time additional person, or, right, the person who's doing restorative practices. So we've got to get to a model that is equitable school funding. And I think sustainable community schools is the way to go once we have a baseline of funds and staff and resources.
Thanks, everyone. Do you have a question?
I do. And I think with principals, with so much weight on the test for our scores, like there's, no matter what they're told, that's always just gonna be so much, right? So it's like, but we know students' trauma impacts those scores. But I was gonna ask, I missed this morning, I was teaching, but the ACE score piece, or the TESE piece, is there discussion around like universal screening across CPS and in schools where populations have higher numbers? Like, that is equity, that is, you get extra funding for a full-time social worker, is that something that is being considered? You know, we know the health outcomes of kids with high scores.
From the equity office perspective, we are having conversations around evidence-based funding, like what does that mean, and how do we make sure that the kids or the young people within our system who have the most need are receiving the most in terms of services and funding. Tilden was one of the community schools at one of the levels of it, and so we know community schools models are very effective. We had conversation about, like, do we do this sort of mass screening? And I just want us to, we have to be prepared also, if we do something like that, to be positioning ourselves to support that sort of mass need. And also, I've always been pushing, like, we can't use some screenings to further, John King said it best. He said that we can't use trauma as an excuse for institutional racism. And also, like, how do we do this at the same time while we do this trauma work, we think about the anti-bias work, because sometimes it might not actually be the ACEs. It could be victimization, and then some other, I think just some other measures that we use. But what I do think is a necessary consideration that we have to have is, how do we bring, to your point, multiple stakeholders to the table, like those who are working in the community, who are serving families, who have experienced not only trauma in their communities, but also recognizing the system that is causing these traumatic experiences. And so, like, how do we look at this from a very complex lens, is one of the things that we're talking about. Like, how do we look at hardships in communities, like which communities around our city have and are experiencing the most hardship, and how do we reframe and redesign this work in service to them and not continue systematic disinvestment across our city.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback and add 2 quick things to that. If we did universal screening, we also have a huge responsibility to then address the information that we're gathering, right? And through the HTT grant, we had that support system in place where we had a full-time clinician who, when these scored 96% of the scores were coming through, could provide support and follow-up. So I think there is talk about it, but I think we have to do it in a really planful, responsible way. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention was there's also a huge barrier of parental consent for universal screening. So the return rate, you know, it's just another issue that to throw into the ring with it. So I just wanted to add that.
And I can say from the mental health advocacy standpoint, people that have been working through the Illinois Children's Mental Health Partnership have been advocating for universal screening for a long time, with the mission that if we screen early and often, maybe in the pediatrician's office, not in the schools, maybe then we can get more services to kids faster. And without knowing the baseline, we're never going to know what the need is and what we need to create. That being said, some of you may know there was a recent law passed that said we were going to add some SEL, social emotional, and maybe social determinants of health screening at those kindergarten, 3rd, 6th, 9th grade. But the challenge with it was that was asked to be done by the pediatricians without addressing any issues around where that information was gonna go. So all the schools were gonna hear was that that was done. So then the pediatricians are thinking, this isn't good. I'm stuck now with all of this information and know where to send it. So I think what you hit upon is a very complex web. And I think this is why it's so important that we have lots of smart people and lots of really engaged voices and differences talking, because we certainly don't want it to backfire. Part of why MTSS and Universal Trauma-Informed Schools is so critical in our city is that we don't really need to screen if 90% of kids have that stressor. What's the point of screening? Why not make those services available to every single kid in the building? And so part of what we have to think about when we're talking about our resources, that's why it's so important that you're here, is what are we doing for every kid that's creating that safety, those relationships, those opportunities, that sense that there's a safe person to go to in my building? And then when do we need more? So the current model, some of you have been talking about behavioral health teams, that says, maybe if a teacher is saying, we have a kid who needs, I'm struggling with, I need more help, that could be the moment to do a trauma screen, because that's a kid who's already demonstrating that there's something going on. So these are complex issues. Many of us have been in these rooms talking about for many, many years, but your point is a good one, which is we know that there's negative outcomes and our kids are experiencing those things. So how do we match the right amount of screening, the right amount of training, the right amount of resources to address all of this? So thank you for asking the question, and we love engagement with the Children's Mental Health Partnership if you're interested. So another question?
Well, it's a
My
part of
last question.
information and also a question. Kind of going back to what you were saying, based on the results of those 10 schools, it's almost unethical not to assume that the same statistics are going to show up in the other schools. And we have to do something about it, and not doing anything about it is contributing to the trauma. And the second part is, Rachel, you mentioned that we should look into community partners that could build Medicaid for the services. And I don't know if you are aware that CPS clinicians, like myself, are providing all the information to CPS. CPS is building Medicaid for all our services, for social work, psychology, nursing, all of the wraparound types of services that we provide to our students. So there is some funding through our work. We don't need to look at other agencies. We can do that if we are allocated the proper amount of time in each school.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think your point is also well taken around Medicaid funding. Right now, most of the billing that goes on for kids getting mental health services is those kids who've already been identified for special education. But there are many creative strategies going on to say, how could we do a better job of billing for services for gen ed students, and then building the capacity either by hiring more people within the district or inviting in community partners. My personal belief is we probably need both and. There's plenty of needs to do all of the above, but we do need to come up with sustainable funding, and part of that might be a Medicaid, certainly should be Medicaid. That's who should be paying for mental health services. It's healthcare, it's not philanthropy's responsibility, and frankly, it shouldn't be taking education dollars, it should be taking healthcare dollars. So we have a lot of room for growth in those areas as well. All right. So we're close to the very end. I'm going to let Michael invite you up to say goodbye. But before I do that, I thought I might just ask if each of you wants to share one word or one wish that you have for the audience in terms of leaving today and thinking about not just what they could do for their own practice, but what they can do for the general effort to try to make our city more equitable and to make our schools and our communities more healing places. One word.
One word?
One word, 2 words.
I guess I would just say sustainability efforts. I know there's a lot of buzz around it, but really thinking long-term of how we can consistently and thoughtfully provide services to our students.
I guess my one word would be two words, continued collaboration.
Mine would be parent engagement and get the students more involved in their own mental health
Mine's gonna be Google, because everyone has an email address nowadays, and everyone actually wants to be involved in health, but CPS is so big, right? But we all can help an individual school. We can all reach out and find a community partner that wants to help our school. So Google them. I've done it. It's great. I think that's how I met you.
I'll underscore shared leadership. What are the opportunities where you can invite voices into your work, particularly students in your schools?
My word is with, because with implies connection. So that we do this, doing that, I gotta do better. With implies connection with someone or something, and so may we do this work with each other.
All right. We give a round of applause for our panel. Thank you, guys.
You know what, Michael, come up and say a few words to end our day?
Sure, just lastly, remember to sign out and get your credits for Illinois State Board of Education for educators out there who do the evaluation. And also, thank you for being here. Thank you for the panelists. Another round of applause for them. And everyone who's here today to take a hard, honest look at what students are facing, what they're going through, and ways we can collaborate to address their needs, to build stronger communities, better schools, and healthier young people. Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. But we started something good today. I have a deep sense that something good will come out of this conference. If it's a meeting, if it's a conversation, if it's an idea you're bringing back to your school. And so my last thought I want to leave everyone with is words from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens could change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So thank you for carrying forth the words, the wisdom, the good vibes today. Hope there was something in it for you. And thank you for spending the day with us. It's been an honor.